we finished our last lecture, or I finished our last lecture, I remember right in the middle of a sentence, the tape stopped just as I was saying, and it.
Which is something like perfection.
Yes. I have no idea what I was going to say at all. I probably didn't have any idea at the time what I was going to say, but we were talking about Socrates' profession of ignorance, and we were pointing out the reality of that. That is, that it was certainly true. That might give us a point of at least making one specific reference to the. I don't know that we wanted to go on with this, but make one reference to the Republic. One of the first incidents in the Republic is the argument with Thrasymachus. I would expect that perhaps by now, in your reading, you would be up to the argument with Thrasymachus. It isn't really where the book starts, but it is the first notable incident after they have established the question, that is the question of what is justice. Thrasymachus claims to know what justice is, and he gives his definition. He's very contemptuous of all of the other participants in this dialogue. He rather scoffs at them because they don't know what justice is, and he says he does know what it is, that he can define it very simply and very easily, and he proceeds to do so. And then Socrates proceeds, as he so frequently does, to demonstrate to Thrasymachus that his definition is inadequate. His object is to try to is not to defeat Thrasymachus. That's a very important point. He has no idea of defeating Thrasymachus or even refuting Thrasymachus. What he wants Thrasymachus himself to see is that his own definition is inadequate and that he does not know what justice is. Now, in this case, as often happens quite often in the dialogues, he fails. He does not succeed in convincing Thrasymachus that he is wrong. And as a result, I think I mentioned this last time, Thrasymachus simply sits out the rest of the dialogue. He stays. He says something, just a little something, much later on in the dialogue. He's still there, but he doesn't say a word. He doesn't really participate in the dialogue at all. But quite often, you will read dialogues. I just happened the other day to read the Euthyphro, which is a dialogue in which Socrates meets a young man outside the courtroom, where, in fact, Socrates is going to be tried for his life. And this young man, Euthyphro, is on his way to the court also, and it turns out that he is bound there to prosecute his own father for manslaughter. And Socrates says to him, well, if you're doing that, then you must know what impiety is, because actually this the charge against his father is manslaughter. But behind it lies an affront to the gods, and therefore it is a crime of impiety. And Socrates himself is accused of this same crime, and so he says to Euthyphro, well, Thrasymachus, or rather Socrates says to Euthyphro, he says, well, that's the very crime that I'm being accused of, and you must know what impiety is, and I don't really know what it is. I don't know what piety is, and so I don't know what impiety is. And so they have a long conversation, or really not a very long conversation, about the nature of piety. And Euthyphro immediately gives a definition, or what he thinks of as a definition. And after really about a half an hour of conversation, they make a complete circle, and they've gotten absolutely nowhere at all. And Euthyphro observes that they seem to have come in a circle, but he doesn't see the point. He still is confident that he knows the nature of piety. And he says to Socrates, finally, he says, well, I have to be going along, Socrates. Socrates is prepared to talk to him all day, if necessary, to try to see if they can make some progress, or at least if he can get Euthyphro to see that he doesn't know. But Euthyphro, it does not. Euthyphro is full of pride. Ultimately, the people who think that they know, especially when they're confronted with some argument to the effect that they don't know, what you see about them is that they are filled with pride in their own knowledge. They are ashamed to admit that they don't know. It's ultimately a moral defect that is behind this failure to ask the philosophical question. Because if you ask the question, if you have the experience of wonder, then you are confessing that you don't know.
The joke in that dialogue all the way through is, though, that he's prosecuting his own father,
yes.
which has to do with piety.
Yes.
That is, piety does have to do with a reverence for one's father. And here this fellow is hauling him into court on charges. So Socrates frequently jests. It's known as Socratic irony. That's the word that's come down to us. I don't know why. There must be some serious history to that word. Socratic irony. It's very famous.
Well, I always thought that it came from the interpretation that Socrates was always saying what he didn't really mean.
Which isn't true.
Which isn't true.
No.
I think that's false. I think that's I think that's a modern. Isn't that a modern?
I don't know. That's why I say I don't know the history of it.
Yeah.
You hear it all the time, and I just don't know who first used it or what the origin of it is. But the formal definition of irony is actually it's kind of a vice.
It's defined in St. Thomas as a vice.
Yeah.
He says ironia is a vice.
Mm. But we take it in the modern world to mean a kind of sophisticated sarcasm and not much more.
Yeah.
But I think whatever the validity of that word is, and I'm not sure it's very much. Its origin in the dialogues is that Socrates does frequently make jokes. That is, he's very fond of a kind of raised eyebrow. The argument will go on and on and on, and there'll be something very plain to all of us, but not plain to the person that he's arguing with, and that becomes a kind of a joke. I think that's probably what it is, and that's certainly what happens in that particular dialogue.
Well, it's perfectly obvious in that dialogue that Euthyphro is something of a fool. He's really very inept. He's supposed to be a kind of expert in religion. He has sort of a certificate, as it were, that shows that he's an expert. He professes to be an expert in religion, and yet when Socrates asks him the question, what is this thing called piety, which is essential to religion, not only does Euthyphro not know what it is, but he doesn't even know what a definition is. he doesn't give a definition at all. It's nothing like a definition. Socrates is always very patient with these things, and what he then does is say, well, now, Euthyphro, that isn't just exactly what I asked you for. That's not the thing that I asked you for. What I wanted to know, what is the quality that all impious acts have in common? Not an example of what an impious act is, but rather what is the quality that inheres in all of them, and he does this very frequently in his dialogues.
Book 2 of the Republic begins with this sentence, as it's translated here by Professor Shorey. When I had said, now Socrates is himself recounting from memory the dialogue. So the I here is Socrates himself. When I had said this, and he's referring back to the whole of Book 1, when I had said this, I supposed that I was done with the subject, but it all turned out to be only a prelude. That's a good word. Proemium is the Greek word, actually. Prologue or prelude. And I think we can take Book 1 as a kind of a little story in itself. It's the story of Thrasymachus. That is, it's the dialogue of Thrasymachus. In fact, some of the scholars have suggested, as you know what scholars do, they always break things up into impossible fragments. And some people have suggested that there was once a dialogue called Thrasymachus, and that Plato later tacked it on to the Republic, which is ridiculous because it's such a perfect prelude to the Republic. But it does, like a prelude, kind of stand alone. That is, there is a beginning and a middle and an end to it. And well, we could stop just for a minute. We haven't talked about this very much. But stories, all stories, have a beginning and a middle and an end. And the word end is used in two senses, or maybe even three. I think we can distinguish three different meanings here of the word end. One is the finish, that is the last word with a period after it, or whatever it is, the punctuation mark after it, and that's, you put the book down. That's just simply the finish. But there is another sense of the word end, that is the end that the author had in mind. Now I think, were just talking, Mr. Quinn was just talking about the end that Socrates has in mind, which really isn't anything definitive. That is, he's not after the idea of end as finishing or completing the definition. He rather has as an end changing the character of the person that he's arguing with. A lot of people get angry at the Platonic dialogues because they say, well, it doesn't ever come to an end. That is, he never defines justice. For example, he sets out by saying, we're going to find out what justice is, and by golly, you can read through all what are there, 10 books of the Republic? You read through the whole 10 books and you never get the formal definition of justice, and therefore it's incomplete. Well, all right. End has the meaning of just the last sentence of the book. It also has the meaning of completion. But then it has the meaning of the end that the author had in mind, that is the purpose. We usually translate it as purpose. There's a fourth that has to be distinguished, and that is end in the sense of the moment of truth. That is what in a story we call the crisis, or the crux, or the denouement. It's the turning point of the story. Now, I just said all that because I wanted to say something else, but we have to fill it in, I think. If you take Book 1 as a little story in itself, as a prelude, then it has its own beginning, middle, and end. And this is a comment on what Mr. Quinn was just saying, I think if you look for the moment where the story turns, it happens right here. Socrates has been questioning him very closely, so that the questions and answers come very, 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 very rapidly. And he winds up by saying, I'll cut into it almost anywhere. But the bad man and the ignoramus will overreach, both like and unlike. So it appears, Thrasymachus said. And does not our unjust man, Thrasymachus, overreach both unlike and like? Did you not say that? I did, he replied. But the just man will not overreach his like, but only his unlike? Yes. Then the just man is like the wise and good, and the unjust is like the bad and the ignoramus. It seems likely. But furthermore, we agreed that each is such as that to which he is like. Yes, we did. Then the just man has turned out on our hands to be good and wise, and the unjust man bad and ignorant. Now, Thrasymachus made all these admissions, not as I lightly narrate them, but with much balking and reluctance, and prodigious sweating, it being summer. And it was then I beheld what I had never seen before, Thrasymachus blushing. Now, that's one of the most famous moments in the history of the world, isn't it? Certainly in literature, that is. Thrasymachus blushes. He will never really admit that he's wrong, but he knows he's wrong. That is, Socrates has piqued his pride, and that blush, that is just marvelous. You could almost see it as in a Technicolor movie. What a scene that would be! You wouldn't have to say anything, but Thrasymachus would turn red as a beet, because clearly Socrates has got him in the argument, and yet so he well, yes, you're right, but he doesn't want to really admit it.
No, he is ashamed.
He's ashamed.
He is
He's
capable of
ashamed.
shame,
Yeah.
and he is ashamed, but he will still not publicly admit that he's wrong. He has a position that he is determined to uphold, whether it is right or not.
That's the thing, I think. Yeah.
I think you would say probably that Thrasymachus knows all along that his definition is wrong, that justice is the interest of the stronger. It's really a very simple doctrine. It's simply the doctrine that might makes right.
And it's a rotten doctrine.
And
everybody holds it. Everybody in the sense of majority, not in the sense of absolutely everybody.
Yeah.
But you hear it all the time, is
Yeah.
what I mean by everybody. And Thrasymachus is sort of the voice of the of the man of no nonsense. He said, "Oh, you and all these discriminations and all this nonsense." Everybody knows that what we're all out is, for me, number one. I'm number one. It's sort of Frank Sinatra striding through the universe.
Yeah, it's what we call the world. What we often in it's kind of the Christian language, we say that's the voice of the world, or the worldly man, whose values are entirely pragmatic views of values of success in the world, in the worldly sense of the word. And you can see, of course, that implicit in that doctrine is the denial of the truth itself. It's a very, very important. This prologue may seem at first sight to be just a kind of waste of time. I think people are rather they're impatient with this book. They say, well, why don't we get on with the argument? This is obviously not going to lead us anywhere. It's kind of a dead end. This man is obviously wrong. Thrasymachus is. Let's get on with the real argument. But this is very important because it disposes of something that is very common in the world. And it is, because you say that might, if you try to take the claim that might constitutes the right, then you are saying something like knowledge is power. That's another worldly wise statement. People who go around saying, well, we all ought to have a good education because knowledge is power. Now, Thrasymachus is saying that in a very serious way. He's saying knowledge is power. It's nothing but power. That's all it is. But if that's true, well, then there really is no truth at all. That's the end. There's no possibility of an argument if it's true that knowledge is reducible to power. It just means that whoever has enough power can declare to be true what is true, whether it is or not.
So it's a denial of truth.
It's a denial of truth. Thrasymachus he's a blunt, bad-mannered, kind of a brutish man. He's kind of a bully. He calls Socrates all sorts of names. He says, "Oh, Socrates, Socrates, you need a nurse." You remember? He says, "Socrates, you need a nurse. You're like
sarcastic.
You're like a baby that's all who's drooling, and you need a nurse to come around and wipe your chin off. You're such a baby." Socrates, of course, Socrates is never angry at those kinds of jibes, and he does quite frequently get them. or occasionally
He gets them
in the
so mad.
dialogues. Yeah,
they stalk off in a rage.
Yeah.
One of them threatens to kill him. Remember, and says, "You're gonna, if you keep that up, you're going to end up in the law courts and you're going to be killed." Of course, we know that he was. We know that he was. It becomes a threat.
Yes.
In fact, wasn't he was among the accusers? I think.
Yes, he was one of them.
I forget now who that was. And it was one of the other dialogues. And I can't remember now just who it was, but Callicles, I think, maybe in the Gorgias. But I'm not sure. But it was one of these sophists, fellows like Thrasymachus, who held that view.
Not all of the Thrasymachus is a sophist, by the way. I don't think we've mentioned that. He is someone who is a teacher belonging to the school, which was very, very popular in the time in Socrates in Athens. It was the leading school in Athens. If you wanted to learn how to become a politician or to be a success in any way in the world, to go back to that figure, you went to the sophists. They're the great enemies of Socrates. And Thrasymachus is one of these sophists. I don't want to say that he's absolutely typical of the sophists. He's a rather low.
Some of them were higher types. Yeah.
Some of them were much higher.
Protagoras was a rather cultured gentleman.
And he was very intelligent. Thrasymachus is not very intelligent at all. He's just a brute. But he does actually enunciate in very plain terms a doctrine that is the doctrine of the sophists. The sophist is a man who's very hard to pin down. The good sophist, the intelligent, clever sophist, is a man that is very hard to pin down. You would never get Protagoras coming right out bluntly and saying that justice is the interest of the strongest. He would never say that because he knows he would get caught very quickly. He's too clever to say that. But Thrasymachus isn't very clever, and so he just bluntly makes this assertion, which is a seriously mistaken position, and it is one which is relatively easily refuted. Although, notice that Socrates, I suppose you could say, never uses more strength than is necessary. He always adapts his argument to the person that he's addressing. He addresses their particular error and the way that they see their own error or what they see as a truth. And he never uses more strength than is necessary to get them to see that their position is false.
He doesn't teach too much.
No, he never teaches too much.
It's kind of economy.
Right, he's addressing Thrasymachus at his own level, precisely because he knows that it is possible, it's just possible that he might be able to get Thrasymachus to see the truth of things. Well, Thrasymachus, however, is a man who is the victim of his own philosophy. He believes that will is what determines the truth of things, and he's being faithful to his own philosophy. He sticks to his own will, and his intelligence is not affected by the arguments of Socrates. He's forced to admit that they're correct.
And so he blushes.
He blushes.
But he doesn't change.
But he doesn't change. He sticks to his position. This is something really that you see quite often. People will they'll see someone doing something obviously wrong or holding to a position which is obviously wrong, which has been refuted, and yet they go right on holding it. And people say, well, why are they doing that? Can't they see that they're wrong? And you have to recognize that it is a question of the will. It really isn't a question of the intelligence at all, but it's a question of the will.
Of course, Socrates has in mind too us, as he knows that people are other people are listening to this argument. That is, in the Republic itself, there are several other people present. He's not talking to Thrasymachus alone. And he surely doesn't teach too much because he has them in mind all along. And he doesn't want to close down the argument. He wants to keep it open because there's so much more to be said.
Well, you see, Glaucon.
Because that's the whole substance of Book Two.
See, Glaucon immediately, after the end of the argument and after Thrasymachus' retirement, as he called it, Thrasymachus says, Glaucon, well, it's right after the sentence that Mr. Senior read originally at the beginning of Book 2. The end, in truth, proved to be only beginning, for Glaucon, who was always the most pugnacious of men, was dissatisfied at Thrasymachus' retirement. He wanted to have the battle out. He is not satisfied with this argument. It's too easy. So he said to me, Socrates, do you wish really to persuade us, or only to seem to have persuaded us that to be just is always better than to be unjust? Now, he of course, Glaucon knows that Socrates has satisfactorily dismissed the position of Thrasymachus, but he says you haven't answered the question that I have in my mind. You haven't managed, he says, to persuade us that to be just is always better than to be unjust.
Yes, the reason why this is a prelude is that the question really hasn't been answered. And one of the mistakes we can make in reading the Republic is a kind of a nice mistake. That is, the first mistake we can make is the mistake of Thrasymachus, which is a nasty mistake. Thrasymachus really has a closed mind. He doesn't want to learn. He thinks he knows it all. He's made up his mind before the conversation starts, and his will takes over, and he argues on the basis of his asserting his own position rather than seriously trying to learn. So that's the first and nasty mistake. But then there's a second mistake, and I think we make it. That is what I meant when I said a moment ago that Socrates has us in mind too. One of the mistakes that we make is we get on Socrates' side right from the beginning. And we're against Thrasymachus. We're the good guys, and he's the bad guy. And we don't listen to the arguments either. That is, we're persuaded too easily. That is, we say, hey, see, Socrates beat him and threw him out. Ha ha, our side won. Now, Glaucon makes neither of those mistakes. He's neither the nasty fellow who won't listen in the first place, nor is he the fellow who says, Socrates beat him. He says, Socrates, I'm not satisfied with those arguments that you use. I know that you're right. I know that justice is something good. But I have never really heard anybody prove to me that it is. I've never heard anybody give the real reasons. And in defeating Thrasymachus, you haven't really done that. And Socrates says something there. He says, Glaucon has said, the case for justice, to prove that it is better than injustice, I have never yet heard. What I desire is to hear an encomium, that means a real praise on justice in and by itself. And Socrates replies, nothing could please me more, said I. For on what subject would a man of sense rather delight to hold and hear discourse again and again? See, now that's what Socrates really wants. Nothing could please me more. He's not really pleased by Thrasymachus because he knows that Thrasymachus doesn't really want to learn. But neither would he be pleased by us if we were those students who said, well, we polished him off. I don't know whether I'm making this clear, but I think the second era is every bit as bad as the first in its way.
Yes.
That is, there are two kinds of closed minds. There are those who are on the other side, and there are those that are on our side. And we think we know it all too, in a way. We think, oh, well, Socrates is obviously right. Justice is better than injustice, and we haven't thought it through either.
Yeah, where you take the partisan position, and you treat philosophy as if it were a matter of politics, where you're on one side and the right side, and the other guys are on the other side, which is the bad side, and you applaud your guy, your partisan. You applaud him. Regardless of how effective he has been, because he's saying what you already believe. Now, Glaucon is quite right. Glaucon is on the right side of this question, and he knows it too. He says, I know, Socrates. He says, I don't believe people like Thrasymachus who go around saying that it isn't really a good thing to be just. I know that that's wrong, he says, but I don't understand it.
I don't know why it's wrong.
I don't know why it's wrong.
I don't really see why it's wrong. It's a good thing for us to take stock of ourselves. Christians, in general. Now, I'm going to make a sweeping statement here. Christians are bad students because they think they know it all. That tends to be true. I mean, over the years of our teaching in universities, we've noticed two kinds of bad students. As I say, they're the kind that won't learn at all simply because they sneer at the truth. But then there are others who won't learn at all because they already think they have the truth. And Christians tend to be in that category. That is, by faith, we know everything, we're on the right side, and they don't really seriously consider the questions. I don't know how many times we've already brought this up, haven't we? I think Mr. Quinn was talking on one of the other tapes about the false Thomist who knows all the answers,
knows the answers.
Who's read some textbook, some manual, and he can rattle off the 5 proofs for the existence of God. And just before we started, Mr. Quinn was talking about a book he'd been reading by the famous Thomist Cardinal Journet, or was he quoting Maritain?
He was quoting Maritain.
He was quoting Jacques Maritain, who had said that Thomas never uses the word proof, he uses the word via, meaning the way, and that this was a kind of modesty. That is, St. Thomas didn't lose his wonder when he talked about the existence of God. It was a way. That is a modest word to use, not proof, as if we've got God all wrapped up.
We talk about the proofs, the 5 proofs for the existence of God, but that word that's really a mistranslation of St. Thomas. He says there are the 5 ways. These are all paths toward the knowledge of God, but they're not. He doesn't use that. See, the word proof has the sound of something that is
all tied up, bound, and dispensed with, and we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. All you have to do is memorize the proof, and you've got it. Whereas that's not true at all.
We must always consider. It's a slow and very humble thing. Every time one of these questions comes up, what is justice? And is justice good? Should one be truthful? It's very easy to say, well, of course, I know the 10 Commandments, and I know what they are, and that's that. And you say, yes, but why are they what they are?
You see, you're really just as bad as Thrasymachus if you do that. Because what you are saying is, I already know.
Same mistake.
I know, it's exactly the same. You have no more wonder in you than Thrasymachus has in him. Because you're saying the same thing. You already know the answer. Now, the fact is that you don't know the answer, you see. Right away, if Glaucon had applauded and said, well, Socrates, I guess that's that. You have shown that that's true. Socrates would have said, oh, is that so? Well, you mean that you know what justice is. Now, he would have been compelled to answer, yes, I do, in which case Socrates would have said to him, well, then, by all means, tell me what justice is, and we can all go home. But, of course, the thing about Glaucon is that Glaucon wants to know the truth, but he realizes that he doesn't see. Just because he knows the answer doesn't mean that he has really come to any understanding of this subject. In a way, he does have the answer. He knows that you should always do the right thing. It's better to do the right thing, and it's always wrong to do the wrong thing. It is.
But he knows it as a child. Though
yeah.
he's been told that that's true. In other words, it's really an act of will,
yes.
Rather than intellect. He's never seen that it really is true, that justice really is.
Yeah.
At one point, I couldn't find the phrase here, but it's right here on the page in front of me, and my eye just isn't picking it up. Thrasymachus uses, or Glaucon uses the phrase, "I am troubled," he said, Socrates. He said, I've listened to people like Thrasymachus. In fact, you can't shut them out. You hear it every day. You read it in the newspapers. You hear it over the radio. Day after day, people say these things. And frankly, Socrates, I know that it's wrong, but I find myself troubled, disturbed by this. And Socrates just loves that guy right then. When he says, "Oh, nothing could please me more," that's now we're going to have a real conversation. Now we're really going to talk about it.
Yeah, I am perplexed, he says in my translation.
Perplexed. Yeah, troubled is the word it used here. It's the same word.
I acknowledge that I am perplexed when I hear the voices of Thrasymachus and myriads of others ninning in my ears. And on the other hand, I have never heard the superiority of justice to injustice maintained by anyone in a satisfactory way.
Now, I think we have to speak about ourselves here. Just the other day, I read in the paper that the Nobel Prize for Economics has been given to a man hitherto relatively obscure, I think. But
George Mason College in University in the South.
But I haven't read him, and I don't know what he really says. I only know what I read in the newspapers and what I hear over the radio. But that's what you hear, see, dinning in my ears.
Yes,
but what
the myriads.
But the myriads. But what they quoted him as saying was, politics is nothing more than the free marketplace in the social rather than in the purely economic order. That is, in the political rather than in the individual order. And he according to these reports, the doctrine that he holds is that the open, free struggle for power, just as in the free market, the old Adam Smith idea of let the market decide what value is. In the political order, political action groups and power groups fight back and forth, and that's what determines politics. Now, if that's what he says, that is the position of Thrasymachus 2,000 years later, being repeated, but obviously much more intelligent and form. But it would be the same position. That is, nothing is really right. Now, the conservatives are hailing this man as one of their champions.
He's one of their men.
And that's why I said us, because we tend to be grouped along with having conservative ideas. That is, conservatives are people who believe in morality, and they believe that you ought to do what's right and what's wrong. But why? And there are philosophers today, apparently even who win Nobel Prizes, that is, great philosophers today, who maintain that the reason why you should do right is that it will give you power. That is, it's the same argument again. That is, that there is no morality in politics. That politics is not a branch of ethics at all. And I think many conservatives hold this view today.
Oh, I do too. Absolutely.
You'll see it in magazines like the National Review, for example, as a kind of a commonplace. That is that people who worry about whether presidents lie, oh, well, that's just so childish. Everybody knows that you have to lie. What you do is you tell the truth to your friends, but you lie to your enemies. No, those arguments are all in the Republic. It's usually considered kind of naive if a person raises the ethical question.
Well, that's exactly Thrasymachus' position. He says that's why he says, Socrates, you're childish. You're childish. Anyone who holds this position is childish. He said, you see, he's the voice of the world. He says, Socrates, the world is not like that. And Socrates, of course, would say to this, he'd say, well, I didn't say the world was like that. I'm not talking about the world. I'm not talking about what people usually do. What I'm trying to find out is what is the nature of this thing we're talking about called justice. Thrasymachus is what we now call a pragmatist. He says, well, look at the world, look at politics. Now, if you look at the way men in politics behave, you can see that they're interested primarily in power. And whoever has the power is able to make the laws. And they're able to dictate what is justice. If you are in power, then you can either get abortion established or you can get it disestablished. And so it all comes down to that.
So politics is the art of gaining political power. That's how it's defined.
Yes, and you're simply talking now about Machiavelli. That's the whole point of Machiavelli.
So we're back here in the Republic, but we're not just reading something removed from ourselves. I think sometimes you can read the Republic purely for pleasure. And you follow these arguments more or less back and forth, and you think, boy, Socrates is a great guy, and I'm on his side, but you don't really seriously apply what he's saying to yourself. I should say to ourself, because I think we're all in this together. That is, one of the reasons why this is a great book is that it's about something important. Now, you might say the truth in itself is important, but I was using the word in another sense. Maybe I didn't use the right word. It's urgent. This is the word I want to use. That is, not only is Socrates here dealing with things that are true, but he's dealing with things that we don't see to be true, day after day after day. It has that urgency about it. Socrates is, after all, on the edge of being executed. How many commentators have said that the death of Socrates is the theme of every dialogue that Plato ever wrote? That is, the shadow of that execution hangs over the whole story. That is, that innocent man was put to death. We as Christians, of course, can see the shadow of Christ our Lord himself by a kind of prophecy hanging over this too.
You should remember that this dialogue was written down after the death of Socrates, not while Socrates was alive. The dialogue obviously took place while he was alive, actually, but it was not written down until after he was executed. And Plato, already knows what happened to Socrates, but everybody knew that this was the direction that things were taking. As you read through other dialogues, you can see people vaguely threatening Socrates. In this dialogue itself, very early here, just a few pages on from where you are right here, in fact, that kind of a threat, or it isn't exactly a threat, kind of a prophecy comes up. Socrates, this is Socrates himself. No, it's Glaucon, I think, who says, let me put these words into the mouth of the eulogists of injustice. They will tell you, the eulogists of injustice, they will tell you that the just man who is thought unjust will be scourged, racked, bound, will have his eyes burned out, and at last, after suffering every kind of evil, he will be impaled. Then he will understand that he ought to seem only and not to be just. Now, you see,
See, Shorey actually uses the word crucified. He admits that it's a tendentious translation, but
well, it's so close. It's so close. It's so
he says,
close.
what they will say is this: that such being his disposition, the just man will have to endure the lash, the rack, chains, the branding iron in his eyes, and finally, after every extremity of suffering, he will be crucified.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly, that's the idea there.
He'll suffer the worst, most ignominious death possible.
And as Christians, we are involved. That is, why was Christ crucified? He was crucified because he was the truth, because he was a witness to this fact that there are principles in this world. They are right and wrong is wrong. And it is not a matter of power or what you want to be true. And there comes a time in your life and in the life of your nation when you have to stand up to those principles, even if you're going to lose. That argument, oh yeah, but if we do that, we'll lose. Why don't we compromise on that? And then tomorrow, when we have the power, then we can do the right. But there is no tomorrow in the political order. It's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, as Macbeth says. The political order is an endless changing of the moon. There is no stability in the political order, and the distinction that Socrates makes is between two famous words in Greek.